The day Ellie Carson walked into the town diner with her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, the whispers started like wildfire across dry grass. By sundown, every soul in Copper Ridge, Wyoming knew the rumor. The sweet kindergarten teacher who'd lost her husband to cancer just 8 months prior was expecting a baby. And by the following morning, when she hadn't denied it, the gossip had turned cruel. But nothing prepared the town for what happened when Jake Thornton, the quiet cowboy who kept to himself on the old Thornton ranch, stood up at the Sunday church service and said words that would change everything. "If that child exists, it's mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Ellie's face drained of all color as every head in the congregation turned to stare at her. Jake didn't look at her, didn't seek her approval. He simply sat back down, adjusted his worn Stetson on his knee, and stared straight ahead at Pastor Williams, who seemed to have forgotten his next line in the sermon. But Jake Thornton had never forgotten anything important in his life. And he wasn't about to start now. He remembered the promise he'd made to Daniel Carson on a cold March night in the hospital, when Daniel's hand had grown weak in his and his breathing had become labored. "Take care of her," Daniel had whispered, his eyes finding Jake's in the dim light. "She's going to need someone, Jake. She won't ask for help, but she'll need it." Jake and Daniel had been friends since childhood. The kind of friends who didn't need many words between them. They'd ridden horses together, fixed fences together, and when Daniel had met Ellie at a county fair 7 years ago, Jake had been the best man at their wedding. He'd watched from a respectful distance as they'd built a life together, always ready to help when called upon, never inserting himself where he didn't belong. When Daniel got sick, Jake had been there for the hospital visits, the late-night calls, the moments when Ellie's strength had finally crumbled and she'd needed someone to simply hold her while she cried. Nothing had ever been inappropriate between them. Nothing had ever crossed the line. But Jake had loved her quietly, distantly, the way you love a sunset you know you'll never touch. Now, as the church service ended and people filed out in awkward clusters, Jake finally let himself look at Ellie. She was standing frozen in her pew, her brown eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been gratitude or might have been horror. He couldn't quite tell. He walked over slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "But I couldn't let them talk about you that way." "Jake, I'm Nota," she started, her voice catching. "I know," he interrupted gently. "But they don't need to know that." Ellie stared at him, tears beginning to pool in her eyes. "Why would you do this? You're going to ruin your reputation for a lie." Jake allowed himself a small, sad smile. "My reputation can handle it. Yours can't." "Not in this town." He paused, then added, "Daniel asked me to take care of you. I intend to keep that promise." The truth was more complicated than anyone in Copper Ridge knew. Ellie wasn't pregnant at all. She'd been violently ill for weeks with what doctors had finally diagnosed as a severe stomach virus. The weight loss, the nausea, the exhaustion, it had all looked suspicious to a town that thrived on speculation. When Mrs. Patterson had seen Ellie leaving Dr. Morrison's office and overheard the nurse saying something about test results, the rumor mill had done the rest. Ellie had been too tired and too grief-stricken to care about defending herself. Let them talk, she'd thought. What did it matter? Daniel was gone, and nothing else seemed to matter much anymore. But Jake had made it matter. Over the next few weeks, Jake played the part perfectly. He showed up at Ellie's small house to fix the loose step on her porch. He brought groceries when her cupboards ran low. He sat with her on the swing that Daniel had built, talking about nothing and everything, giving her the kind of steady presence that asked for nothing in return. The town watched, their judgment now redirected at Jake, the cowboy who'd supposedly gotten involved with his best friend's widow before the grass had even settled on Daniel's grave. The whispers followed him into the feed store, the bank, the diner. Old friends turned cold shoulders. His ranch hands asked uncomfortable questions that he deflected with silence. Through it all, Jake never wavered. He never explained, never defended himself, never asked Ellie to set the record straight. He simply absorbed the town's scorn like he was built for it. One evening, About a month after his declaration in church, Ellie couldn't take it anymore. She found Jake in his barn, tending to a mare that was about to foal. "This has to stop," she said without preamble. "I'm going to tell everyone the truth." Jake didn't look up from examining the horse. "And what truth is that?" "That I'm not pregnant. That we're not together. That you lied to protect me from gossip that I should have been strong enough to ignore in the first place." Now Jake did look at her, his blue eyes steady in the lamplight. "You think that'll make it better? You think they'll apologize for assuming the worst about you? They'll just find something else to talk about, Ellie. At least this way, you're not alone in it." "But you are," she said, her voice breaking. "You're alone in it because of me." Jake set down his equipment and walked over to her slowly. "I've been alone for a long time," he said quietly. "It doesn't scare me. What scares me is the thought of you going through what you're going through without anyone standing beside you." "Why?" Ellie whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Jake looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never allowed herself to notice before. "Because Daniel asked me to take care of you," he said. "And because I want to." The mare shifted behind them, and Jake turned back to his work. But Ellie stayed, watching him work with the gentle competence that had always characterized everything he did. She thought about all the times he'd been there over the past months. The quiet strength, the unwavering support, the way he never asked for credit or recognition, never demanded anything in return. She thought about Daniel, who had known Jake better than anyone, who had trusted him with his final request. And she thought about how Jake was honoring that trust in a way that was costing him everything. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. It started with Ellie insisting on helping Jake with ranch work, claiming she needed something to do with her hands. Then it was shared meals that stretched late into the evening, conversations that went deeper than either of them had intended, laughter that felt like betrayal at first, then slowly began to feel like healing. The town's judgment became background noise. They built something real in the space that the lie had created, a friendship that was growing into something neither of them had words for yet. Then, on a crisp October evening, everything changed again. Ellie was helping Jake in the barn when the mare finally went into labor. The birth was complicated, and for hours they worked together in tense silence. Jake's hands steady and sure as he guided the foal into the world while Ellie supported the exhausted mare. When the foal finally emerged, slick and perfect and alive, they both sat back in the hay, covered in sweat and blood and tears of relief. The mare immediately turned to tend to her baby, and in that moment of pure life and new beginnings, Ellie looked at Jake and saw him clearly for the first time. He was crying. This strong, silent man who had endured weeks of public scorn without flinching was crying at the sight of new life. "Jake," she said softly, and when he turned to her, she kissed him. It wasn't dramatic or passionate. It was gentle and grateful and full of something that felt like coming home. When they pulled apart, Jake looked at her with wonder and fear. "Ellie, I know," she said. "I know you loved Daniel. I know you're doing this for him. But Jake, you're allowed to live too." "We both are." Jake touched her face carefully, like she might disappear. "I don't want to dishonor his memory." "You're not," Ellie said firmly. "You're honoring it. He knew us both better than we knew ourselves. He asked you to take care of me because he trusted you. But I think maybe he also knew that you needed someone to take care of too." They sat in the barn as dawn began to break, watching the foal struggle to its feet on wobbly legs, determined to stand despite falling again and again. Each time it fell, the mare encouraged it with gentle nudges. And each time, it tried again. 3 months later, Jake and Ellie stood in the same church where he'd claimed a child that didn't exist. This time, they stood together, hands joined, as Pastor Williams married them in a quiet ceremony attended by only a handful of people who'd never believed the worst. On their way out of the church, they ran into Mrs. Patterson, the woman whose loose tongue had started everything. She looked embarrassed and started to apologize. But Ellie stopped her with a gentle smile. "It's okay," Ellie said, squeezing Jake's hand. "Everything worked out exactly as it was meant to." As they drove back to the ranch now, Jake glanced over at Ellie. "Do you ever regret it, the way it all happened?" Ellie thought about the rumor that had sparked it all. about Jake's outrageous claim, about the judgment they'd endured and the love they'd found in spite of it all. She thought about how sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the strangest soil. "No," she said honestly, "I think Daniel knew exactly what he was doing when he asked you to take care of me. And I think you knew exactly what you were doing when you stood up in the church and claimed a child that didn't exist." Jake smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "Maybe I was claiming something else," he said quietly. "Maybe I was claiming a future I didn't think I deserved." "You deserve everything good," Ellie said firmly, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life approving it to you." 6 months later, when Ellie actually did become pregnant, the town watched with knowing smiles as Jake fussed over her like she was made of glass. Some people still remembered the rumor and the scandal, but most had moved on to other gossip, other stories. Only Jake and Ellie knew the truth, that sometimes the biggest lies protect the most important truths. That sacrifice and selflessness can open doors that fear keeps locked. That grief doesn't have to end in isolation, and that love doesn't follow anyone's timeline but its own. When their daughter was born on a warm spring morning, they named her Hope. Because that's what Jake had given Ellie when she'd needed it most, and not just protection from gossip or support through grief, but the hope that life could begin again, that love could come twice, and that sometimes the most unexpected promises lead to the most beautiful destinations. And every year on the anniversary of that Sunday morning when Jake had stood up in church and claimed a child that didn't exist, they celebrated quietly, because that was the day their real story began, the one about a cowboy who loved selflessly, a widow who learned to hope again, and the power of standing beside someone even when the whole world is watching with judgment in their eyes.